We've been blaming the wrong thing for years. When a great game underperforms, we assume something inside it failed. The mechanics weren't strong enough, the design didn't resonate, the market spoke. But in a lot of cases, the trajectory was already set before launch day. Not because the game was bad, but because the conditions around it had already decided the outcome. And if you only look at review scores and sales charts, you miss that completely. Because sometimes great games don't fail. They get released into forces that were already in motion. When a game struggles at launch, the conversation almost always stays inside the disc. We analyze pacing, balance, creative decisions, but again and again, the real cause sits outside the box. Timing, platform instability, cultural momentum, expectation misfires, emotional resistance, forces that were already in motion. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The game didn't change, the environment did. And sometimes that's enough to seal its fate. Some games don't launch into a market, they launch into a migration. By the end of a console's life cycle, something predictable happens. The install base still exists, but attention does not. Retailers shrink shelf space, coverage shifts forward, marketing budgets thin out. Not because the old system disappears, because the future is louder. Okami launched on PlayStation 2 in late 2006. It was visually stunning, critically praised, but the industry had already moved on to PlayStation 3. PS2 wasn't where the conversation lived anymore. It's where the conversation had been. And when players are mentally upgrading, hesitation is fatal. Timing does not care how good your game is. Sometimes it's not when you launch, it's where. When a platform starts collapsing, everything attached to it collapses too. The marketing dries up, retail confidence disappears, the install base shrinks, and at that point, quality becomes secondary to survival. Skies of Arcadia launched on the Dreamcast just as Sega was beginning to retreat. It was ambitious, expansive, it was critically strong, but in the Dreamcast shrinking install base, it wasn't competing for dominance, it was competing for oxygen. The Dreamcast didn't fail because its games lacked quality. It failed because momentum was shifting elsewhere. And when the platform falls, sadly, great games fall with it. But even stable platforms can betray a game, because markets build momentum, audiences develop habits, and habits are hard to interrupt. Eco launched into a PlayStation 2 era defined by scale and spectacle, and Eco offered silence, minimal guidance, emotional restraint, stillness. It asked players to slow down. The industry was accelerating. It wasn't misdesigned, it was misaligned with the moment. When a game moves against momentum, it doesn't necessarily spark debate. Often, it just gets overlooked. Some games, though, don't arrive behind the curve. They arrive ahead of it. And I think Metal Gear Solid 2 is a perfect example of this. And yes, I know it sold extremely well. This wasn't a commercial failure. But commercial success and cultural alignment are not the same thing. The game was technically impressive. It might have been one of the most polished games ever released up to that point. But its thematic bait and switch was very confrontational at the time. The protagonist swap, the commentary on information control, the deliberate subversion of expectation. At launch, to many that felt like betrayal, because players were expecting a continuation of the first game. Instead, they got almost a critique of it. The backlash wasn't about quality, it was about expectation. Now, years later, the conversation has changed. What once felt deceptive now feels intentional. What once felt irritating now feels prophetic. It wasn't reckless, it was just early. And when a game challenges its audience before they're ready, even success can feel like resistance. Sometimes the problem isn't timing or platform, it's framing. Marketing doesn't just advertise, it sets expectation, and expectation becomes judgment. Earthbound, I believe, is the clearest example of this. Its campaign leaned into gross out humor and gimmicks. It framed the game as weird, disposable, ironic. But Earthbound wasn't ironic. It was sincere. Underneath the absurdity was warmth and melancholy. Players didn't reject the game's heart, they rejected the version they thought they were buying. When expectation and reality collide, players don't blame the trailer, they blame the game. And once that perception sets in, it's incredibly hard to reverse. And finally, some games aren't rejected because they're confusing. They're rejected because they're uncomfortable. Majora's Mask followed one of the most celebrated games ever made. Players expected heroism, triumph, something familiar. Instead, they got anxiety, a ticking clock, a falling moon, a world trapped in repetition. It wasn't broken, it was oppressive, but intentionally. It asked players to sit with dread, to confront inevitability. That wasn't the fantasy many players expected from a Zelda game. Now, years later, it's praised for its boldness, but at launch, it felt wrong. It seems when a franchise violates comfort, resistance is automatic. Look at all these together. The games didn't change, the conditions did. Timing, platform stability, cultural momentum, expectation framing, emotional alignment, forces that start moving long before launch day. So the next time you see a so-called flop from the past, don't just ask if it was good. Ask, what did it launch into? Because in many cases, the outcome wasn't decided by quality. It was decided by context. And history didn't ignore these games. It just caught up later. I guarantee there's at least one game you've called a flop that now deserves a second look. Please share it in the comments and tell me what circumstances you think initially killed it. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and happy gaming, my friends.